Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video, which is designed to tell us a little bit more about AQA health and the people. And here we are thinking about medicine in the Middle Ages. And just before I start, I'd just like to say thank you for the positive comments and sort of responses and things that I've had from people. So real pleased about that. You know, as they say on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, give me a like, and we'll see how we get on. Okay, so basically today we are focusing on the role of the church. The role of the church in medicine, in the Middle Ages particularly, and thinking about what impact the church had on medical progress. And like all these things, it's not necessarily a straightforward answer. Okay, basically, if you asked sort of somebody who had never been in one of Mr. Coop's lessons about what impact the church had had on medical progress in the Middle Ages, the general answer would probably be that they'd held it back, that the church had held back medical progress. That's kind of the accepted view. So, the expectation is that kind of that's the easier angle to take. But really what we want to be doing is we want to be adding complexity to our answers about the church, and we do that by kind of questioning our assumptions and thinking in new ways and thinking in different ways that kind of go beyond the norm. Okay, so if we kind of take a few aspects of what the church was doing and think about those in turn, and in each case kind of look at the sort of the kind of accepted view of what the church was up to, and then look at kind of the counter argument. So it'd be a bit of a kind of yes, no, did help, didn't help kind of discussion. Okay. So first thing to obviously be aware of is that if somebody is ill, they've only got limited amount of time to get better, or a limited amount of resources to get themselves better. And what you can quite easily argue is that if that person is ill and they're spending their time, pursuing a religious treatment for their illness, then they're not necessarily going to be doing much to kind of help themselves. And obviously that was the approach of many, many people in the Middle Ages when it came to medicine and when it came to health. So rather than spending time pursuing the kind of cures that might actually work, what people were doing instead, they were encouraged to kind of, because they were seeing everything through this lens of the kind of battle between good and evil that we've talked about in previous videos, then obviously if it's either God or the devil that's caused your illness, or the demons, or even the supernatural, then if that is what you believe, then your time is going to be spent going for a religious cure. And so that obviously is going to get in the way of you being able to spend that time and those resources on pursuing the kind of cure that we now know would work for the kind of diseases that people were suffering from. So people would spend their time praying for deliverance from illness. They would spend their time having mass. They would spend their time going on pilgrimage to holy sites to get cured. They would go and see the priest if they were unwell, rather than anything that we would kind of think of as a doctor. They would go and make offerings to God, make prayers to God, in order to be delivered from illness, either because God had sent that illness as a punishment and they wanted to repent and they wanted to go back on their sort of sinful life, or because they were seeking God's help in kind of battling the devil or a demon who was attacking them and making them unwell. Okay, there are some well-known examples of holy sites that pilgrims would go to. They might be going to Lourdes, which is a holy site even now, where people go for healing. They might go to essentially what they tended to go to were the places that had become associated with holiness, if you like, and that really goes back to kind of pagan and Roman times, when holy places tended to be places where sort of mystical, magical things happened. One of the most common of which was things like if there was a spring or something like that, water coming out of the ground, it was seen as kind of a holy place. So Lourdes, for example, has like healing water. and others kind of places like that. Or perhaps it might be a site that was associated with a particular saint, because remember, in the Catholic Church, you don't sort of go directly to God. You, as an individual person, speaks to the priest speaks to the saint, who's dead, who's in heaven. The saint speaks to Mary, and Mary speaks to God. So if you were to go to the place where a saint had lived, then you could ask that saint for some help. And here we've got St. John of that is St. John of Bridlington, because he was a saint who'd kind of carried out some healing miracles during his life, and so he was made into a saint after his death, and his site was a place of pilgrimage, his burial site in Bridlington. People could come and get healed there. Okay, so that is obviously taking a lot of time from people and a lot of resources, and it's also encouraging, sick people to go on long journeys where they're walking, across the countryside, even across Europe. There was whole networks of pilgrimage sites across Europe, and people were encouraged to go on these pilgrimages to show their sort of desire to repent their sins and to get healing from God. And you can imagine that that's obviously going to have an impact on the spread of diseases as people are traveling from one place to another, and that's not really going to aid their their kind of not going to make them better if they're wandering across open landscapes, barren fields and things, often with no shoes on, often wearing uncomfortable clothes, specifically to try and show how sorry they were. So that's not going to be advancing medicine very much at all. Okay. However, the church, you can argue, instead had another role to play, which is kind of linked with that, which is that in order for those people to travel across the landscape and for them to go from one place to another, then they need to be put up in somewhere to sleep, somewhere to stay. And the church wants to encourage people to do this, because obviously it adds to the power and authority of the church. If people, can have some, they think that God's causing disease. So the church set up what we might think of as hospitality for travellers, and hospitality for travellers means hotels and pubs. That's what we mean now by the word hospitality. At the time, they created buildings that were based around hospitality, and we would call them hospitals now. Okay, so just a sort of reminder, really, that if you ever hear the phrase hospitality industry, it doesn't mean hospitals. It means hotels and pubs and those kind of things for travellers. That's what the word hospitals mean. And if you're hospitable, it means you accept strangers into your house, for example. Well, in this case, the church are setting up hospitals, and they are providing hospitality for people that are moving on pilgrimage from one place to another. Now, remember, we're always looking for the beginnings of modern medicine in the past, and we see here the church being responsible as an organisation for running the things that later become hospitals. Okay, so the church in that case is helping progress. They're moving medicine on because they're providing healthcare for. Okay, there was a slight technical hitch there. I think I ran out of recording space on my phone, but hopefully I've stitched the two videos together by now. I think what we just talked about was hospitals and the way in which the church provided hospitality for people who were pilgrims moving across the landscape. So that kind of, is a way in which the church helped medical progress move on, which sounds great. And then once again, because we're looking at this in kind of different ways, one of the issues then is, okay, so if these hospitals kind of move medicine on, how did they do that? And then we need to look in detail at the kind of treatments that were available in those hospitals, and therein lies the problem. Because as these hospitals were not actually genuinely for necessarily sick people, there were lots of reasons why people might go on pilgrimage, not all of them to do with sickness. These hospitals were not primarily for healthcare or for treatment. They were for what we would now call hospitality, which is acting like hotels and restaurants. So these hospitals, which were often run by monks, they were maybe attached to monasteries, which were where monks lived, they would instead provide, a really basic standard of hospitality, which has some overlaps with healthcare. So, for example, you might arrive at the hospital, and on entry, your clothes might be boiled, which would, be in order to clean them, which is obviously going to have some healthcare benefits. You'd be given maybe a bed to sleep in, some rest, which again has healthcare benefits. You might have a good meal. You would perhaps get some limited direct healthcare from the monks or the nuns that ran the hospital. So, for instance, if you're on a pilgrimage and you're walking across England with no shoes on, you're going to have sore feet. You might get your feet bandaged up. You might get a little bit of kind of healthcare in that sense, just to look after your kind of bodily needs, so you can carry on your pilgrimage. It's perhaps worth saying as well that in a monastery, the older monks would also be put into these hospitals. They wouldn't necessarily live in the dormitories like the younger monks. They would be kept in the hospital, and they'd have a little bit of treatment there. I think we said last time about monks and nuns providing some healthcare and using herbal remedies to do so, and the cloister garden that monasteries had. So, there is sort of some herbal remedies that are used in these hospitals for people, but primarily the focus is on getting the person or keeping the person sort of warm and dry and ready to move on their pilgrimage to the next location on the map, if you like. So really not what we would consider to be like a hospital now. And in fact, if you've got people who are sick moving around from one place to another, and then you're concentrating them all in one place, they're all going to the hospital on their way, on their pilgrimage, that's going to be spreading disease between them. Okay, so limited direct healthcare, as we would call it, even though these institutions became the forerunners of modern hospitals. Okay, with a bit of help from people such as Florence Nightingale, etc. So hospitals are kind of one of those topics, those subjects that you can easily talk about both sides of the argument, and you can use them, to discuss how the church both helped and hindered. In terms of what happened in a hospital, you get a bit of treatment and you get a bit of help, but they are primarily religious institutions. They're going to be promoting kind of religious cures. If it's in a monastery, there would be a timetable for prayers for the monks that would take them all through the night. So you're not talking about somewhere necessarily where you're going to rest. You might actually have to be up in the middle of the night, going off to the chapel in the monastery, and there in the chapel doing your prayers in the middle of the night, trying to show again your kind of how much you're wanting to repent of your sins, etc. So it's a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to that. Okay, so another way in which it can be argued about the church helping or hindering progress is about the fact that the church controlled the flow of information in society. Information and knowledge, scientific research, is what has allowed us to develop new medical treatments with kind of rigorous standards of kind of testing, observation, using the scientific method. But there was nothing like that during the Middle Ages. I think we said in a previous video about how the church promoted the writings of Galen. Galen had written about a creator God, and the writings of Hippocrates with the four humours. And the church promoted the direct use of the conclusions of those thinkers, but not the methods that those thinkers used. So when we come to look at the Renaissance, which is our next time period after this, we'll see that we get the development of the scientific method, and that's going back to the kind of methods of inquiry that the Greeks and Romans had used. That's a resurrection of those, a renaissance of them, a rebirth of those methods. In the Middle Ages, it's the obsession with the conclusions of Galen and Hippocrates, not their methods, not their kind of observation, they're looking at the world, but the the idea that you accept it because God has sent this person to tell us something about the world, and that's the difference. So when the church promoted the writings of Galen, it wasn't the methods of him. It wasn't the dissection. It wasn't the observation of gladiator wounds, etc., that Galen had. Instead, it was his conclusions. Okay, it was his writings. And the important thing in the medieval mind was to understand the writings, not the method that he used to get there. So that promotion of Galen, to the extent whereby anybody who questioned Galen was seen as a heretic, somebody who was against the church, and therefore subject to punishment by the church, which during the later Middle Ages may have included, things like being burnt at the stake, etc. That's because people have questioned Galen, and Galen was promoted by the church. So the full force of the church's power and authority goes against anybody who questions Galen's conclusions. Now, the scientific method, which we'll study in a later video, is based first on questions. And if you can't ask questions, then you can't do science. And I think we said previously that the way people in the Middle Ages thought, largely because of how they'd been brought up in such a religious society, was that there were no questions that were worth asking, except the ones that were answered in the Bible or in the works of Galen. Because why would a loving God have not given us the answers to all the important questions? So we don't need to ask any questions that we can't find an answer to in the Bible. It's not a question worth asking. So therefore, there's no compulsion to do any research, to do any sort of investigations, no observation of anything apart from learning the works of Galen, learning what's in the Bible, learning the works of Hippocrates and other authors that the church approved of. Okay, and this obviously has an impact on medical progress that just leads to stasis, no improvement in medical progress throughout the Middle Ages, and that's that's because of the control of the church on that flow of information. Okay, so that's the kind of easy answer, that the church controlled information. But it is just worth saying, a proviso to that, sort of maybe just countering that slightly, is the fact that the church was an organization that was across the whole of Europe, and it did unite Europe as a whole, to the extent that Latin was the language used in the church. Okay, it's not the language of ordinary people, but it's the language that's used across Europe. It's a bit like having a kind of international language that would allow some flow of communication on the seldom occasions, on the unusual times when new things were discovered. They could perhaps spread more easily because of the use of Latin in the church, across the whole European landscape. That becomes more of an issue when we get to the Renaissance, because Renaissance changes in Italy can spread quite quickly into Northern Europe through the use of the Latin language. Okay, so that's kind of the role of the church there. The only other thing, which isn't much touched on in the textbook, but we have done some lessons on it, is the fact that the church initially set up the universities. So university education was first developed by the church as a way of training up monks, nuns, priests in order to read the Bible, because the Bible was in Latin. It wasn't in the everyday language of people, and people generally were illiterate during the Middle Ages. They weren't able to read. And so university education was important in training up people to interpret the Bible. And the church controlled that interpretation. So, the priest would read the Bible in Latin. The ordinary people didn't understand Latin, or had limited understanding of it, and they didn't have access to the Bible themselves. That flow of information was controlled by the church. But in order to do that, they had to set up universities to train monks and nuns and priests to do that. As society became more densely populated, I suppose, more and more emphasis fell to monks and nuns and priests to provide healthcare, And so the universities started to run courses in anatomy or in sort of medical knowledge through the universities. And that was the church itself educating people to take on that role so that monks and nuns and priests could carry on doing the praying and carry on doing the religious side of things. So the very first university trained doctors were trained by the church in order to help monks and nuns crack on with their religious work and to take that burden from them. And so we do get the first formal medical training in Europe coming through the role of the church. So by the sort of late Middle Ages, 1300s, 1400s, we've got universities established in European towns, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Milan. These kind of places have universities in them, and those universities are then training up people to provide medical care. Now, slight problem with that, as we've touched on in previous videos, is that the training that they undertook was not what we would understand as medical training. It wasn't training that was hands-on. It wasn't training that was active or practical training. Instead, it was, as we'd expect in the Middle Ages, very much based on a knowledge of Galen, Hippocrates, perhaps Rhazes, Avicenna, people, who in other civilizations and in other parts of the world had done scientific research, if you like, built up some knowledge. But here the training is about knowing the conclusions again, and not the techniques, not the way that they found that information out, but what their answers were, because God has provided those answers for us and we shouldn't be asking questions of it. So a typical medieval, I think there's one back here, medieval university classroom. Here we've got a dissection in a university classroom, and here's the lecturer, and he's giving a lesson in dissection. And as you can see, it's not interactive. There's someone doing the dissections, but here are the students most of them, like many of you sometimes, seem to be, these two are just chatting among themselves, not really paying attention. They're going to be listening to what the lecturer is saying whilst the body is kind of dissected and cut up in front of them, and he's going to be reading from Galen's book, and or possibly the writings of Hippocrates, more likely Galen if it's a dissection. And as we said before, they weren't really looking at what the body had in it, they were just interpreting what the body had in it through the works of Galen. And because most of the people who the church didn't allow people to dissect in the Middle Ages, as we've mentioned before, again, another way that they held back progress, they very rarely allowed people to be dissected, and if they did, it would probably have been somebody who was a criminal, maybe been executed, and then the argument that was used when their body was different from Galen's writing, because Galen, remember, dissected pigs and dogs and monkeys, when their body was different, was that somehow their body had been corrupted by the fact that they'd been a criminal, or corrupted by the fact that the devil had obviously been in there and made them into criminals, and perhaps they'd been they were malformed when they were made by God. So that's why their body is different from Galen. So still Galen was held as being the authority, even in the face of the evidence that people saw in front of their eyes. Okay, and any kind of exam, these two might fail because they're not paying attention, but any kind of exam that these doctors would have to pass would be, reciting the works of Galen. I think we've said, they stood for a week, day after day after day, just reciting what Galen had written to show that they'd learnt it. And then you get to the situation where, okay, so now these people have qualified. Well, there's not very many of them, and if any resource in society is quite rare, then it becomes more and more expensive. So really, for these guys who've been university educated, we're talking about, they're going to be providing healthcare just for the very rich elite families in the towns of medieval Europe. They're not really for ordinary people, and they're certainly not kind of provided for the poor by government or anything like that. These people are going to cost a lot of money to get their help. It basically would be seen as a way of them making a living in the world. So, the argument is that they're just interested in getting money rather than healthcare. That has just while we're talking about that, has another knock-on effect, because just bear in mind the numbers of times you go to the doctor and the doctor says, yeah, you've got this, you've got that, you need to go home and do nothing. And we all go, oh yeah, that's fine, that's great, I'll go home and do nothing. The only reason we accept that is because we haven't paid for the doctor. In our system, we have the National Health Service. We don't pay when we go and visit. We pay in our taxes beforehand. And therefore, we can quite happily accept, we go to the doctor and he says, look, the best thing is just to rest. I'm not going to give you any medicine. I'm not going to cut it off. I'm just going to allow you to rest and recover. And we happily accept that. But imagine a different situation if you'd gone to see one of these guys and you had said, okay, I've got such and such wrong with me. And they said, yeah, that's great. You pay me. You hand over your groats or your gold pieces. And then the guy says, thanks for the payment. The thing you need to do is absolutely nothing. And you sort of think, well, what have I just paid for then? So there's an emphasis on the doctors of the Middle Ages actually, when they do get involved in healthcare, or physicians we should really call them, not quite doctors, physicians in the Middle Ages, when they do get involved in healthcare, to actually overdo stuff, to do more than they should, not to leave things to heal. We know the body heals many, many illnesses and ailments given enough time. But these guys would be wanting to cut it off, dig it out, give you this, give you that, in order to justify the fact that you're paying them. And so one of the kind of directions that medicine has moved in from the Middle Ages onwards, sort of after the Middle Ages, and as we've got better healthcare that's free at the point of delivery, you don't have to pay for it when you get it, we've actually moved away from doing things, from intervening, and more towards allowing time for the body to heal itself. And that's not possible if you are paying your doctor, because you just think, well, I've been swizzed. What have I given you this groat for if you've just told me to go and rest at home? I know I need to rest at home. That's what I want to do. It's what my body's telling me to do. What I want you to do something because I've just paid you. So it's not until you get healthcare that's free or accessible for, without payment that you can really move to a point where doctors can start saying, well, let's look at your symptoms, let's give it some time, let's see how it develops, let's have a rest and see if your body can heal itself. Otherwise, you'd be sort of saying, well, what am I paying the doctor for? Okay, so again, some yes and some no. Churches running universities. Universities are teaching the works of Galen. The physicians that come out of universities are probably too interventionists. They do too many interventions. They should leave things to recover. And they don't actually learn courses in anatomy. They're not really learning practical skills. They're just learning sort of book learning. We know that in most universities there wouldn't have been dissections in most years. You might get a couple of dissections every few years. And I think if we just say several universities, we know that they went for hundreds of years without any dissections. So that is not providing the kind of training that we would have looked for. Okay. So there you go. We've talked a little bit about churches. We've talked about their role in providing healthcare. As we've mentioned previously, public health in the Middle Ages, which we'll quickly talk about next on the next video, it wasn't provided by the government. Largely, the government was run for the benefit of the king and his ruling king, sometimes the queen, and their ruling family. And their primary concern was defence of their realm, defence of the religion. The church's primary concern was promoting Christianity and promoting the power of the church. But they did take on some roles in providing what we could kind of characterize as like the beginnings of public health. But as we've discussed, their use of hospitals was mostly for pilgrims. Their use of their use of the universities was not really providing the kind of medical training that we would be looking for in terms of healthcare professionals now. Okay, so we've seen positives and negatives for the church, and in terms of what impact they made, whether you come down on the positive side or the negative side, the important thing is that you work through and think through those different examples, those different arguments before coming to that kind of conclusion that you're looking for. Remembering that superstition and religion is one of our themes that we've had at the back of our books. And in the Middle Ages, you've got this really nice kind of back and forward argument between how the church helped and how the church hindered. And now, unlike the person we mentioned at the beginning of this video who'd never been to one of Mr. Coop's lessons, you can make those complex arguments in ways that your average Joe on the street wouldn't necessarily be able to do so. So I hope that's helped. Like I said before, subscribe, like, and we'll get another video up soon. Thank you very much. Bye for now.